Hello and welcome to another video. Now, it's starting to move towards summer, and what a lot of people think about in summer is barbecue. So today we're going to make what has quickly become my favorite barbecue sauce in the world. This is Mambo sauce. Now, barbecue sauce has a very interesting and intercontinental history going back into the 17th century. I'd like to talk a little bit about that because this is extremely interesting from a history of food perspective and provides, I think, a greater appreciation to a lot of things around us today. So I'm going to talk about history for a little bit. I will post the time point in the comments where we start moving into the ingredients. So if all of this history stuff isn't interesting to you, that it's easier for you to skip. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the history, and then we will introduce this dish and move forward. The word barbecue itself comes from Spanish observations of certain native cooking techniques where they would have a rack of typically hunted game animals suspended somewhere above a fire. This is somewhat different from the way we cook barbecue today. And so today, especially because the weather isn't so nice, I'm going to do the ribs in the oven. But the whole word is, as I say, based upon native cooking techniques that involve slow cooking meat over a fire in some way or another. In some cases, similar techniques were used in the New World by native groups where meat was actually slow cooked under a fire, coated with certain kinds of, put under certain kinds of leaves, maybe coated with a layer of dirt or something to protect it from burning, and then a fire built on top. In all these cases, we're talking about a very slow cooked process. So the original barbecue process is much more like a hog roast in, say, Costa Rica than it is the way we think of it today. But this is still something which is kind of worth mentioning here, because I think that this is part of the reason why some of these sauces do very well with oven cooking methods as well. Now, we've talked about the word barbecue. Now I'm going to talk about barbecue sauce. And barbecue sauce has a very different history. The earliest references we have to barbecue sauce appear to be largely African recipes. Typically mixtures of hot chili peppers and limes. Now that sounds very Mexican or South American, which suggests a lot of cross-pollination of sort of high African cuisine of the 17th century and New World cuisine in Central and South America. Now, the thing about this is the earliest barbecue sauces basically being chili peppers and lime juices is telling in itself because this suggests that they were originally sour and spicy. It's a little different from the sort of sauces that became popular in the US later. Then with the international or intercontinental slave trade, one of the things that happened was, people started to try to recreate their cuisines from home with a very limited and very different set of ingredients. So from this area, the vinegar-based barbecue sauces were born. These are vinegar, typically hot chili peppers, typically some other spices, and they're cooked again as a marinade and dipping sauce for the meat. Later on, so within this genre, then of course we start to see like vinegar and mustard sauces, as maybe mustard replaces chili pepper and things like that. Those predominate throughout the 19th century and well into the early 20th century. So it's only in about 1930 when we start seeing tomato-based barbecue sauces And most of those start looking very much like, in the early years, very much like cocktail sauce today. So it's like tomatoes and horseradish and stuff. And so what we have now is something that maybe has some influence from the vinegar-based sauces, but might be much more like a tomato-based sauce today. So this whole genre has gone through a very, very, very massive and slow evolution after, of course, the Civil War in the United States. Barbecue sauces, of course, reached out into a different demographic. Barbecue itself became a different institution at that point. In the 1930s, of course, tomatoes get added. And then the next chapter in the story becomes the beginning of Mambo sauce in the 1950s. Now, Mambo sauce starts off as a Chicago barbecue sauce. And it starts off by a black man who was the son of a farmer who actually owned his land. So relatively well off as far as particularly black Americans at the time. And he decided he wanted to run his own business. And so he started this barbecue place in Chicago and started making his favorite barbecue sauce. And this became a sensation. Pretty soon they were bottling it. Eventually they contracted with a company called Select Foods to bottle it for them. And this became Mambo sauce. Within 10 years of this, another variant of the same barbecue sauce now is found in DC and spreads into the Chinese restaurants in the area. But what makes Mambo sauce interesting cuisine-wise is that in some ways it's a return to roots. It's slightly spicy. It includes a fairly heavy vinegar note, so it's more tangy. It's tangy, it's a little sweet, it's spicy, and this becomes sort of a massively interesting barbecue sauce. Now in DC, eventually the Chinese restaurants start picking up on it and they make their own versions. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is, again, a very, very, very storied development. Barbecue sauces are not sort of the simple commercial condiments, I think, that Americans tend to think of them as. Now, the Mambo sauce I'm going to make today is influenced by all of these eras and all of these steps. So it's going to include, it's going to start with a very tangy base. We're going to add the sugar to make it a little sweeter. We're going to add the tomato to thicken it. We're going to add some of the spices that have become common in some of the DC variants. And we're going to produce a really, really, really wonderful, spicy, sweet, and sour barbecue sauce that's completely worth learning to make yourself. But looking back at the history, one of the things that's really critical to understand here is that while there is a certain Eurocentric narrative about the impacts of the slave trade from Africa to the US, there was also a lot of cross pollination culture-wise. And so this particular dish, while it carries with it a lot of very painful points in history, also carries with it a story of how cultures have interacted in cuisines and foods, and things have become cultural institutions which wouldn't exist if it weren't for the contributions, for example, of Black Americans. On to the ingredients. So, of course, I'm going to start with vinegar. Most recipes call for a white vinegar. I'm using a white wine vinegar, and I'm using a white wine vinegar because it, I think, gives a slightly more rounded flavor, but white vinegar will work. I have pineapple juice, which we're going to use as the main fruit base. I'm going to have tomato paste. We're going to have some sugar to make this to make this both sweet and sour. We add garlic and ginger. So here we are, garlic and ginger. And we have hot sauce, in this case some Tabasco sauce. Now, you can also just use cayenne pepper or other chili peppers, but fairly typically people use Tabasco sauce or another hot sauce. Now, my proportions are, I start with a 1/4 liter of pineapple juice. And to this, I'm going to add 1/8 of a liter of vinegar. So some places, you know, you can vary the amount of the pineapple juice or the vinegar, but these are the proportions that I've come to like. And to this, we are going to add this entire tube of tomato paste. Now, sort of, a lot of your older barbecue recipes will call for ketchup, which is perfectly fine. It's just a slightly different way of processing the tomatoes. I prefer tomato paste because I think it gives a less of an overwhelming tomato flavor. And the main purpose of the tomatoes anyway is to act as a thickener. It's not really there to add a huge amount of flavor. So to this, we're going to sprinkle in a significant amount of garlic and a bit of ginger. And this is totally to taste. And then we will add hot sauce to taste. I'm just going to add this whole bit in. And then I'm going to add a bit of salt, again to taste. Some people, especially like the more Chinese influenced versions, will use soy sauce instead. Then I'm going to heat this up, stir it up, and simmer it to thicken it. While this is heating up, I'm going to add, just take a normal spoon from the table and add maybe 2, 3 if you like it sweeter, spoonfuls of sugar. And we'll go ahead and stir this as it warms up also. Okay, so now we've simmered this for about 10 or 15 minutes, and you can see it's thickened up kind of nicely. Now, an important word here is that the more tomato you add, the less complex the flavors become. And so there's a balance of making it thick enough for what you want to coat with it and making it thin enough that the fruity and spice flavors come through right. So I think that this is okay. My next step is I'm going to prepare my ribs, and I'm going to go ahead and put them in the oven. Now, for the ribs, I'm going to do a very simple wet rub. I'm going to start with a dry rub, basically of some salt, pepper, and then I'm going to rub it further with a little bit of pineapple juice and then with a little bit of vinegar. So I'm just going to take a small dab of pineapple juice, and I'm going to add it as I rub things in on the bottom. I'm going to do the same thing with vinegar. what I usually do is I just take my open palm, I just pour, and I drip a little bit on, and then I'm going to flip them over, and I'm going to do the same. So, a little bit of pineapple juice. That's a little more than I needed. But since I'm going to add this barbecue sauce on top, if I have a little more than I expect, it's fine. It'll go into this sauce, and that's good. There we go. Now I'm going to spoon over this a bit of the sauce. It doesn't have to be a huge amount. We're not here to pour the entire sauce over and completely braise it. But as we cook this, the moisture from the sauce is going to help to have these ribs really tender and juicy. So just a little bit of sauce on the top. I'm going to cover this, and I'm going to bake it at 150 for another hour. And then we'll come back and we'll have more of the sauce for dipping. So now this has been in for about an hour, and so it's time to move on to the next phase of cooking. I'm just going to take the foil off, and you can see this is not super tender yet, but it is relatively well cooked through. And I'm going to put this back, same temperature, and I'm going to let this cook for another half an hour to an hour. And as it cooks, it should continue to soften up. It'll be really delicious. So now these have been in for another 30 minutes or so, and so pulled them out. The meat's starting to shrink back a bit. I think these are ready to serve. So I've cut one rib off for the taste test, but I'm actually going to spoon a little more barbecue sauce on top, and a little bit onto the side for dipping if I like. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a taste test. Anyway, Mambo sauce ribs. And anyway, now for the taste test. This is delicious. This is absolutely delicious. This is my favorite barbecue sauce for a reason. It's flavorful. It complements the meat really well, brings out a lot. Absolutely delicious. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this recipe. Bon appetit, and see you next week.